The two words were, Exhibit 1. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you how a family spends 32 years building a case against their own daughter, and how I spent 14 months building the only one that mattered. My name is Nadia Okafor Brennan. I am 34 years old. I run a logistics and supply chain company called Meridian Transit Solutions, headquartered in Columbus, Ohio, with satellite operations in Atlanta, Dallas, and Toronto. As of last fiscal year, Meridian was valued at $47.3 million. We move medical equipment, pharmaceutical cold chain cargo, and time-sensitive industrial parts across North America. We employ 214 people. My parents, Clement and Vivienne Okafor, sued me for all of it. I want to be precise about what they claimed. They didn't allege that I stole a specific sum. They didn't point to a particular transaction or document. Their complaint, filed in Franklin County Common Pleas Court on a Tuesday morning in March, alleged that the entirety of Meridian Transit Solutions was built on misappropriated family capital and intellectual property, and that as the rightful originators of that capital, they were entitled to full ownership and dissolution of my personal assets, estimated in their filing at approximately $47 million in business equity plus $2.3 million in personal holdings. Their attorney, a man named Douglas Fitch, who wore the same confident expression in every courtroom photo I found when I Googled him at midnight the night before trial, summarized their position in his opening statement as follows. Everything this young woman owns was built on stolen family capital. He said it with the kind of certainty that comes from never having been proven wrong in front of someone who came prepared. I had been prepared for 14 months. Let me tell you who my parents are before I tell you what they did, because I think it matters. I think it explains, not excuses, explains, how two people who are not evil in any cartoonish sense can still cause the kind of damage that takes years to name correctly. Clement Okafor came to the United States from Lagos in 1981 with a graduate scholarship and a single suitcase. He earned a master's degree in civil engineering, worked his way into a mid-level project management role at a construction firm, and spent 26 years building a reputation as the most reliable man in any room he entered. He was disciplined, exacting, and proud, fiercely, almost painfully proud, in the way that men who built something from nothing sometimes are. He believed in hierarchy. He believed that success flowed downward through families the way money flowed through proper channels. From the source outward, the patriarch first. My mother, Vivienne, was born in Cincinnati to a Haitian-American family that had its own complicated architecture of silence and expectation. She was brilliant, genuinely, remarkably brilliant, and had set aside a law career after my older brother Marcus was born because my father believed, and she eventually accepted, that the family's resources could only support one professional trajectory at a time. She redirected that intelligence into managing the family's finances, the household, and the social infrastructure that kept my father's career moving. She was the person behind every decision, which is partly why she could never acknowledge being behind any of them. They were not cruel people in the abstract. They donated to the church building fund. They brought food when neighbors were sick. My father coached Marcus's little league team for 6 seasons. My mother organized the Okafor cousins' annual reunion every July without complaint. What they were, with me, was consistently, systematically dismissive in a way that felt less like hatred and more like a kind of administrative error, as though I had arrived in the family filing system under the wrong category and no one had bothered to reclassify me. Marcus was the success story. Marcus was pre-med by 16, Johns Hopkins undergraduate, internal medicine residency at Cleveland Clinic. Marcus bought a house at 30. Marcus called every Sunday. Marcus was the proof that the Okafor family had made it in America. I was the one who studied logistics and supply chain management at Ohio State, which my father referred to at my graduation dinner as a degree in driving trucks. I was the one who spent 3 years after graduation working warehouse operations for a mid-size freight company, learning how pharmaceutical cold chain logistics actually function from the floor up, not the conference room down. I was the one who, at 26, asked my parents for a $12,000 loan to cover the first 3 months of operating costs for a company I'd spent 2 years planning. My father said no. Not unkindly, he said no the way he said most things, with a kind of settled authority that didn't invite conversation. He said the logistics industry was too volatile. He said I didn't have enough experience. He said, and this is the part one wrote down in my journal that night because I knew even then I might need to remember it accurately, Nadia, you have never demonstrated the kind of judgment that justifies this kind of risk. Not with money. Not with anything. My mother said nothing. She looked at the tablecloth. I borrowed the $12,000 from my college roommate Desiree's father, a retired postal logistics supervisor named Gerald Washington, who had watched me present my business plan at their kitchen table and said, "You've already done the homework. Just do the work." I paid him back with interest within 18 months. He is now on Meridian's advisory board and plays golf with our CFO on alternating Saturdays. Meridian's first 3 years were not a success story. They were a survival story. I ran operations out of a 900-square-foot office in a shared workspace in Westerville, Ohio. My first employee was a dispatcher named Terrence who had been laid off from a larger carrier and agreed to work for below-market salary in exchange for a small equity stake. My first contract was a single pharmaceutical client, a regional biotech distributor who needed cold chain transport for a narrow window of clinical trial materials. The contract was worth $84,000 over 8 months. I stayed in that office until 11 o'clock most nights. I drove shipments myself twice when drivers called in sick for time-sensitive deliveries. I did not tell my parents how it was going. They did not ask. The few family dinners I attended during those years followed a reliable pattern. My father would ask Marcus about his practice, my mother would ask Marcus about his social life, someone would eventually ask me something politely vague about my job, and I would give a politely vague answer and we would all move forward. What I didn't know then, and discovered later through a conversation with my cousin Adiz that I will return to, was that my parents were not simply disinterested. They had, in fact, been discussing my business, specifically its likelihood of failure, with relatives, family, friends, and at least one occasion my father's former colleague at the engineering firm. My mother had apparently told Aunt Rita at the July 2016 family reunion that Nadia is playing at business and we're waiting for her to come back to reality. I was, at that moment, finalizing a contract renewal that would bring Meridian's annual revenue past $1.2 million for the first time. By year 5, Meridian had 12 full-time employees, 3 dedicated cold chain routes, and a contract with a national pharmaceutical distributor that generated $4.7 million in annual revenue. I moved into a proper office. I hired an operations manager. I brought on a part-time CFO who became full-time within 8 months. I did not mention any of this to my parents. This wasn't strategic at first, it was protective. I had learned somewhere in those early years that sharing good news with my family produced a particular kind of response that was worse in its way than indifference. There would be a pause, then a qualification, then a redirect toward Marcus. My father once responded to my mention of a new contract by saying, "That's fine, but you should think about what happens when these pharmaceutical companies consolidate. You'll need a backup plan." I had just told him we'd signed a $2 million contract. He did not ask the name of the client. He did not ask how I'd won it. He offered a contingency plan for its failure before he'd finished his coffee. So I stopped sharing. And in the silence I think my parents constructed their own version of my life. One in which I was perpetually on the edge of collapse, sustained by some form of family goodwill or resource they couldn't quite identify but were certain they deserved credit for. That belief was, I think, the seed of what happened later. The trigger when it came was not dramatic in itself. It arrived in the form of a family dinner, my father's 68th birthday, November of the year before the lawsuit. Marcus flew in from Cleveland. Aunt Rita drove from Dayton. My cousin Adiz was there with her husband. It was the kind of dinner where the table was set with the good china and my mother had been cooking since morning. Somewhere between the jollof rice and the cake my father made a toast. He thanked my mother. He praised Marcus's recent promotion to department chief. He spoke about legacy, the word he returned to most reliably in his late 60s, and about what it meant to build something that outlasted you. Then he looked at me and said in front of everyone with the measured tone of a man who believed he was being generous, "Nadia, I hope you understand that everything you have has roots here. In this family. I hope one day you'll find a way to honor that properly." The table was quiet. Marcus looked at his plate. Adiz met my eyes for exactly 1 second before looking away. I said, "Thank you for dinner, Dad." I drove home that night and sat in my car in the parking garage of my building for 22 minutes. I wasn't crying, I want to be clear about that, not because tears would have been wrong, but because what I felt wasn't grief anymore. It had moved past grief into something colder and more structural. It felt like recognition. Like watching a pattern complete itself. 3 months later, I received a certified letter from the law offices of Douglas H. Fitch and Associates. I called my attorney Simone Adeyemi before I called anyone else. Simone and I had worked together for 4 years on Meridian's corporate legal matters. Contracts, IP, one prior employment dispute. And I trusted her the way you trust someone who has read every document you've ever signed and still returns your calls on weekends. She read the complaint and was quiet for a long moment. "Nadia," she said, "this is aggressive and it is almost entirely without merit. But almost is the word we need to work with." Their claim rested on 3 pillars. First, that my father had provided foundational business guidance and intellectual framework during Meridian's formation that constituted a form of uncompensated contribution. Second, that a $3,500 check my father had written to me in 2014, a birthday gift I had deposited and, in their telling, used for business expenses, represented an undisclosed equity investment. Third, that family property, specifically a storage unit registered in my father's name that I had used briefly in 2015 to store equipment during an office transition, represented an ongoing in-kind contribution to my business operations for which they were owed compensation. I stared at the ceiling of Simone's conference room. "The $3,500 was a birthday check," I said. "There's a card. It says, 'Happy birthday, love, Dad.'" "I know," Simone said. "We'll need the card." I had the card. I had kept it not for legal reasons, but because it was the only birthday card my father had ever signed with the word love, and I had held on to it with the particular careful sadness of someone who collects the exceptions that prove the rule. We spent the next 14 months building our case. I want to describe this period accurately because it is easy in retrospect to make it sound clean. The protagonist gathering her documents, preparing her arsenal. In reality, it was 14 months of living with a lawsuit filed by my parents hanging over every workday and every family obligation and every quiet moment I might otherwise have used for something else. Meridian was navigating a major contract renegotiation during this period. We were expanding our Dallas operation. I was hiring for 3 new senior positions simultaneously. I had a company to run, 214 people whose livelihoods depended on decisions I needed to make clearly and without the static of a lawsuit my own parents had filed against me humming in the background of every meeting. My operations manager, a former military logistics officer named Kwame Asante, knew something was wrong within the first month. He didn't ask. He simply started scheduling our weekly check-ins for Friday afternoons instead of Monday mornings. "So you have the weekend to process anything heavy," he said without specifying what heavy thing he had noticed. That small recalibration, unrequested and unexplained, kept me functional through more Fridays than I can count. Desiree, who by then had become Meridian's head of client relations, took on 2 of my scheduled client dinners without being asked, citing a scheduling conflict she and I both knew didn't exist. Her father Gerald, when I told him about the lawsuit over the phone, was quiet for a long time before saying, "You have every document you need. I know you kept everything." He was right. I had kept everything. My brother Marcus called me 6 weeks after the lawsuit was filed. I want to give him the credit he deserves here and also the truth. He called to tell me he thought our parents had made a mistake, and also to ask if there was any version of this that could be resolved without going to court. He was not asking on their behalf, he clarified. He was asking because he understood better than most people how much damage a public proceeding could do to a family that had spent decades maintaining a careful image. I told him I had not filed this lawsuit. I told him I would defend it completely. I told him I loved him, which was true, and then I told him I couldn't keep having this conversation, which was also true. He sent me a text 2 days later that said, "Whatever happens, I'm your brother." That's not on the table. I saved that text. I have looked at it more times than I planned to. The trial was set for a Thursday in May. I wore a charcoal blazer over a white silk blouse. Pearl earrings my maternal grandmother had given me at my college graduation, the same grandmother who had, without my parents' knowledge, quietly told me the year before she died that she believed in me more than I knew. I carried a single leather document folio. I arrived at the Franklin County Courthouse at 7:45 for a 9 o'clock start. I sat in a conference room with Simone and her associate, A meticulous young attorney named Brandon Chu who had spent 3 weeks doing nothing but cross-referencing every financial record we possessed against the claims in the complaint. Brandon had found in that process something we hadn't initially looked for, but I'll get to that. My parents arrived with Douglas Fitch at 8:50. My mother was wearing the navy dress she wore to important occasions. My father was in his best suit, the dark one with the faint pinstripe he'd bought for Marcus's medical school graduation. They did not look at me in the hallway. The courtroom was smaller than courtrooms look on television. Pale wood paneling, fluorescent overhead supplemented by narrow windows, an American flag beside the bench that was slightly crooked. Judge Helene Marbury presided. She was in her mid-50s, efficient, and had the particular manner of a judge who had heard too many cases built on family grievance dressed up as legal principle. He was not hostile. He was not sympathetic. He was reading. Douglas Fitch gave his opening statement with the confidence of a man who had decided the case was already decided. Everything this young woman owns was built on stolen family capital. My father nodded at strategic intervals. My mother kept her hands folded in her lap with the careful stillness of someone practicing composure. Simone gave our opening statement. She was specific, organized, and brief. She laid out the timeline of Meridian's founding with the precision of a surgical incision. The date of incorporation, the source of initial capital, the progression of revenue, the complete absence of any financial contribution from the plaintiffs. She did not editorialize. He did not need to. Then Judge Marbury turned to me and asked whether I had anything to add before we proceeded. I stood. I adjusted my jacket. I looked directly at Douglas Fitch across the aisle. I said, "Exhibit 1. The court reporter stopped typing. She looked up. Fitch blinked. His associate leaned forward. Simone placed the first document in front of the judge. Exhibit 1 was the original loan agreement between myself and Gerald Washington, dated March 14, 2013, in the amount of $12,000, bearing both our signatures and the notarization of a Columbus area notary public. Attached to it was the repayment ledger, fully annotated, showing every payment made between April 2013 and September 2014, totaling $12,840, principal plus agreed interest. Attached to that was a signed letter from Gerald Washington confirming that the loan had been repaid in full and that he retained no equity, financial claim, or outstanding interest in Meridian Transit Solutions. Exhibit 2 was Meridian's original certificate of incorporation, filed with the Ohio Secretary of State's office on March 28, 2013. Sole incorporator, Nadia M. Okafor Brennan. 0 co-founders. 0 listed investors. Exhibit 3 was the birthday card. A standard Hallmark card with a cardinal on the front, signed in my father's handwriting. Happy birthday, sweetheart. Love Fit. $3,500 for whatever you need. No mention of investment. No mention of business. No terms, no equity, no written agreement of any kind. Exhibit 4 was my mother's own handwriting. A letter she had sent me in 2015, which I had kept in the same box as the birthday card, in which she referenced my business with the phrase, "your little company," and expressed hope that I would eventually find something more stable. Not the language of an investor. Not the language of a contributor. The language of dismissal, preserved in ink, dated, signed. Exhibit 5 was a property records document showing that the storage unit my father had registered in his name, the one they claimed constituted a continuing in-kind contribution, had been listed for sale in December 2015 and transferred to a new owner in January 2016. It had not been in my father's possession for 8 years. The claim that it represented an ongoing contribution was not merely weak. It was factually impossible. Douglas Fitch objected to Exhibit 3 on grounds of relevance. Judge Marbury overruled him with the brief efficiency of someone who had already understood what she was looking at. Then Simone said, "Your Honor, with the court's permission, the defense would like to present Exhibit 6. This was what Brandon Chu had found during his 3 weeks of cross-referencing. Exhibit 6 was a filing with the Ohio Secretary of State from 2019, showing the incorporation of a company called Clement O. Logistics Advisory LLC, a consulting firm registered in my father's name, which had, in its first 2 years of operation, invoiced 3 separate clients using language, service descriptions, and operational frameworks that Brandon had traced, document by document, to internal Meridian operational manuals I had authored between 2015 and 2017. My father had not stolen my company. But he had, it appeared, borrowed liberally from the documented operational methodology I had developed to build one of his own. A small one, a quiet one that had generated less than $200,000 in total revenue across 4 years and had apparently not thrived, without attribution, without acknowledgement, without ever having mentioned to me that he had done so. The room was very quiet. My father looked at the document for a long time. Then he looked at his attorney. Fitch leaned over and whispered something. My father said nothing. My mother's hands, still folded in her lap, tightened. Judge Marbury reviewed Exhibit 6 for 3 full minutes. Then she looked up at Douglas Fitch and said, in the measured tone of a judge who has decided to be generous with her patients for precisely as long as the record requires, "Counsel, I'd like to understand the plaintiff's theory of the case in light of this exhibit." Fitch stood. He said the exhibit was circumstantial. He said any similarity in language was coincidental. He said his clients had decades of business knowledge and had every right to apply their general expertise. Judge Marbury said, "Their general expertise." Fitch said, "Yes, Your Honor." The judge looked at him for a moment that lasted slightly longer than necessary. "The same expertise," she said, "that the complaint alleges was so uniquely foundational to the defendant's company that she owes them its entire value?" Fitch had no answer for that. He attempted one. It trailed off. Court recessed for lunch. I ate a sandwich in the conference room with Simone and Brandon. I wasn't hungry. I ate it because Simone had brought it and because the afternoon session required me to be functional, and I had learned, somewhere in the logistics industry, that you fuel the operation regardless of how you feel about the fuel. Simone said she thought Marbury was going to rule for us comprehensively. Brandon said he thought Fitch might try to withdraw before she did. I said, "What happens to my father's LC?" They looked at each other. "That's a separate question," Simone said carefully. "One thing at a time." The afternoon session was shorter than the morning. Fitch called my father to the stand. My father testified with the same settled authority he brought to everything. His tone never wavered, his posture never shifted. He said he had provided guidance. He said he had offered his knowledge. He said the $3,500 had been intended as a business investment and that, in our family, these things are understood without paperwork. Simone's cross-examination was 6 questions. The first was, "Mr. Okafor, in March 2013, did you decline to provide a $12,000 loan to your daughter for the purpose of starting Meridian Transit Solutions?" My father paused. Then, "I advised against the venture at that time. Did you decline to provide the loan? Yes or no?" Yes. No further questions on this point. Second question. The storage unit described in Exhibit 5. When did you last have legal ownership of that property? He looked at Fitch. Fitch could not help him. January 2016, I believe. So you had no ownership of this property for 8 years prior to filing this claim? The use. I'm asking about ownership, Mr. Okafor. No. The remaining 4 questions addressed the birthday card, the letter my mother had written, and the operational documents in Exhibit 6. My father answered each one in a voice that grew incrementally quieter, the way a structure settles when weight is removed from it. Not collapse. Settlement. When he stepped down from the stand, he walked past the defense table. He did not look at me. But for a single second as he passed, his pace slowed, barely, almost imperceptibly, in the way a person pauses at something they can't bring themselves to look at directly. I don't know what to do with that half second. I have thought about it many times since. Judge Marbury issued her ruling the following Tuesday. She dismissed the complaint in its entirety. She found that the plaintiffs had failed to establish any legal basis for their claim of misappropriated capital, that the $3,500 check constituted a gift under Ohio law with no documented conditions, and that the storage unit claim was not only unsubstantiated but factually incoherent given the property's sale in 2016. She also noted, in language I asked Simone to read to me a second time to make sure I'd heard it correctly, that the court views with concern the apparent pattern of conduct in which the plaintiffs filed claims of significant financial magnitude without evidentiary foundation, and reserves the right to consider sanctions pending a review of filings. Sanctions were assessed 60 days later. Douglas Fitch's firm was ordered to pay $43,000 in defense legal fees. My parents were ordered to pay $17,500 in court costs. I do not feel triumphant about the sanctions. I want to be precise about that. There was no satisfaction in the number. There was something else. A kind of exhausted correctness, the way a long equation finally balances and you feel not joy but the particular relief of verified accuracy. Marcus called me the night of the ruling. He said he was sorry. He said it simply, without qualification, without explaining what exactly he was sorry for, which meant he understood that the list was too long to itemize. I appreciated that. I said I was okay. He said, "You're not, though." I said, "No. But I will be." We talked for 40 minutes about other things. His daughter's first word, a documentary we'd both seen, the way the Columbus weather had been strange that spring. It was the longest conversation we'd had in 3 years. It felt like finding a room in a house you'd been locked out of and discovering it had always been unlocked. I don't know what happens with my parents. I want to be honest about that in a way that resists the clean resolution this kind of story is supposed to provide. My father has not contacted me. My mother sent a text message 2 weeks after the ruling that said, "I hope you're well." I read it 7 times and did not respond. I'm not sure what a response would be. I'm not sure what the text was. What I know is this: the $47 million is mine. Earned, documented, defensible. 14 years of supply chain routes and cold storage logistics and pharmaceutical contracts and 214 people showing up because the operation is sound. My father did not build that. My mother's dismissal did not build that. The birthday card did not build that. Gerald Washington's faith built some of it. Desiree's loyalty built some of it. Terrence's willingness to work for equity in a company that hadn't proved anything yet built some of it. Kwame's quiet Friday afternoon reschedules built some of it. And I built the rest. I am in my office right now, a good office with a window that faces east, and there is a cup of coffee going cold on my desk because I got absorbed in a contract review and forgot it was there. In an hour I have a call with our Toronto operation about a new pharmaceutical client. After that I'm having dinner with Desiree, who is 3 months pregnant with her first child and wants my advice on maternity leave policy, which I will give her and then revise our company policy to reflect, because that is how you build something that lasts. My grandmother's pearl earrings are in a small dish on my desk. I wore them to court. I wear them on days that matter. Today matters. Most days do when you are paying attention. The 2 words were Exhibit 1. And what they meant, what I meant, was, I kept everything. I kept everything and I was ready, and I have been ready for longer than you knew to look. That is what I said with 2 words in a courtroom in Columbus, Ohio on a Thursday in May. The court reporter stopped typing because she needed to see what came next. So did I.